October 25th, 1944. 20 miles off the coast of Samar Island, Philippines. Signalman 3rd Class. Robert Copeland stood on the bridge wing of USS Samuel B. Roberts as the impossible materialized through the dawn haze. Pagodas. Massive superstructures rising from the horizon like steel cathedrals. His hands tightened on the signal lamp as he counted them. 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, light cruisers, destroyers. The entire Japanese center force, steaming directly toward the thin screen of escort carriers and destroyers protecting the Leyte invasion beaches. Then he saw the giant, Yamato, the largest battleship ever constructed. Her 18.1-inch main guns, each shell weighing 3,200 pounds, were trained on the tiny escort carriers wallowing 7 miles ahead. One salvo from these guns could obliterate an entire city block. The escort carriers they were protecting displaced 7,800 tons. Yamato displaced 72,000. Copeland watched colored splashes erupt around USS White Plains. The Japanese were using different dye loads to spot their fall of shot. Pink, green, yellow, red. Each color belonged to a different warship. The kaleidoscope of death crept closer with every salvo. Behind those thin-skinned escort carriers sat 4,000 Marines, the reserve force for Leyte Gulf, packed into transports with nowhere to run. If the Japanese battleships broke through, the invasion could collapse. MacArthur's return to the Philippines would become MacArthur's Dunkirk. Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland, no relation to the signalman, picked up the TBS radio handset on Samuel B. Roberts's bridge. The destroyer Escort displaced 1,350 tons. Yamato's secondary battery guns were bigger than Roberts's main guns. What happened in the next 90 minutes would be studied at naval academies for the next 80 years as either the most suicidal or most heroic action in U.S. Navy history. By October 1944, Japan's strategic situation had become desperate. The combined fleet had suffered catastrophic losses at Midway, the Philippine Sea, and in the grinding attrition of the Solomon Islands campaign. American forces were now poised to sever Japan's lifeline to the resource-rich East Indies. The invasion of Leyte represented an existential threat. If the Philippines fell, Japan's oil imports would be cut to zero within months. Admiral Somu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, devised Operation Shogo, Victory Operation. It was a gamble born of desperation. 3 Japanese naval forces would converge on Leyte Gulf from different directions, crush the American invasion fleet, and destroy the amphibious forces ashore. The center force, commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, represented the main striking power. Yamato and her sister, ship Musashi, supported by 3 other battleships and a screen of heavy cruisers. The Americans had anticipated a naval response. Admiral William Bull Halsey commanded the fast carriers of 3rd Fleet, the most powerful naval force ever assembled. But Halsey's carriers were designed for offensive operations, not convoy escort. The actual protection of the Leyte beachhead fell to 7th Fleet under Vice Admiral Thomas Kincaid, and 7th Fleet's striking power was concentrated in 6 battleships, all World War I-era vessels resurrected from Pearl Harbor's mud. They were positioned 30 miles south, guarding against the Japanese southern force. That left the northern approaches covered by 3 groups of escort carriers, Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3. Escort carriers were merchant hulls converted for aviation duty. They displaced less than a heavy cruiser. Their maximum speed was 17.5 knots. A fast battleship could make 27. They carried 28 aircraft each, FM-2 Wildcats for combat air patrol and TBM Avengers for anti-submarine work and ground support. These were not fleet carriers. They were aerial trucks meant to ferry replacement aircraft and provide close air support to troops ashore. Taffy 3, the northernmost group, consisted of 6 escort carriers screened by 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. The destroyers, USS Hoel, Heermann, and Johnston, displaced 2,100 tons each and carried 5 5-inch guns. The destroyer escorts were even smaller, 1 350 tons, 2 5-inch guns, 3 40mm mounts, and torpedo tubes that seemed almost optimistic. Commander Ernest E. Evans, commanding officer of USS Johnston, had told his crew at commissioning, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." It was not empty bravado. Evans was a Cherokee from Oklahoma who had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1931. He believed destroyers existed for one purpose: to attack. What none of the Americans knew on the night of October 24th was that Admiral Halsey had taken the bait. Japanese carriers, empty shells with almost no aircraft, had appeared to the north. Halsey had taken every fast carrier, every fast battleship, and steamed north to annihilate them. He had left San Bernardino Strait completely unguarded. At 0645 hours on October 25th, Japanese lookouts spotted Taffy 3's masts against the dawn sky. Kurita's staff identified them as fleet carriers, the primary target. The admiral immediately ordered a general attack. 23 Japanese warships swung toward 6 escort carriers and 7 escorts. The range was 35,000 yards. Yamato's 18.1-inch guns could reach 45,000 yards. The escort carriers' 5-inch stern guns, their only armament, maxed out at 18,000 yards. They couldn't even shoot back. Rear Admiral Clifton Ziggy Sprague, commanding Taffy 3 from USS Fanshawe Bay, began transmitting in the clear on every frequency. Enemy battleships sighted. Request immediate assistance. There was no help within 2 hours steaming time. The battleships to the south were too far. Halsey's carriers were 300 miles north chasing phantoms. Taffy 3 was alone. Admiral Kurita believed he had trapped American fleet carriers. Intelligence had reported that escort carriers operated far from combat zones. The silhouettes emerging from the dawn haze, the frantic launching of aircraft, the destroyer screen moving to intercept, everything suggested he had achieved the ultimate prize. One of his staff officers would later write, "We had them. The carriers were within gun range. We could see their aircraft launching. This was the victory Shogo promised." The Japanese had every reason for confidence. Yamato alone displaced more than all 6 escort carriers combined. Her main battery could fire a 3,200-pound armor-piercing shell, designed to penetrate 16 inches of steel plate at 25,000 yards, every 40 seconds per turret. Even near misses would generate underwater shockwaves capable of rupturing hull plating. A single direct hit would saw an escort carrier in half. The American destroyers charging toward them were mosquitoes. Kurita's heavy cruisers, Haguro, Tone, Chikuma, each carried 10 8-inch guns and displaced 15,000 tons. They had sunk Allied cruisers at Java Sea and Savo Island. Now they faced targets 1/7 their size. What Kurita didn't understand was that everything about American destroyer doctrine had changed since 1942. At Savo Island, American destroyers had hesitated, waiting for orders, maintaining formation. The Navy had lost 4 cruisers that night because destroyer commanders feared independent action. The lessons had been written in blood. Initiative beats coordination. Audacity beats caution. In destroyer versus cruiser actions, the only chance of survival is making the enemy afraid. But doctrine was one thing. Reality was another. The destroyers of Taffy 3 were outgunned by margins that made theoretical tactics meaningless. Tone's 8-inch guns could reach 30,000 yards. Johnston's 5-inch guns maxed at 18,000. The Japanese could kill them long before they entered effective range. The mathematics were brutal. A destroyer had perhaps 12 torpedoes, 10 in the tubes, 2 reloads if the crew survived long enough. Each torpedo ran at 27 knots for 15,000 yards. Japanese battleships could maneuver at 27 knots. The probability of a hit against alerted targets with room to maneuver ran below 15% even in ideal conditions. This was not ideal. This was a surface action in daylight against the most powerful surface force Japan still possessed. And even if torpedoes hit, even if every warhead detonated perfectly, Japanese battleships carried torpedo bulges and compartmentalization that had been refined through 30 years of design evolution. Yamato had survived multiple submarine torpedoes during her career. She could absorb damage that would obliterate 3 destroyers. The destroyer escorts were even more overmatched. Samuel B. Roberts, Raymond, Dennis, and John C. Butler were submarine hunters, not surface combatants. Their 5-inch guns were primarily for self-defense. Their crews had trained for convoy escort in the Atlantic, not gun duels with cruisers. They had no armor. They had no speed advantage. They carried so little ammunition that a sustained engagement would see them empty their magazines in 20 minutes. Then, Commander Evans's voice crackled across the TBS radio. "Commence attack. All ships, follow me." He wasn't waiting for orders. There weren't going to be any orders. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about the battle off Samar. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard about Taffy 3 and the destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts before, the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship. And if you're enjoying these deep dives into World War II naval history, hit that subscribe button. These stories take serious research to get the details right, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. At 07:16 hours, USS Johnston turned toward the Japanese fleet and increased to flank speed. She had been laying smoke to screen the carriers. Commander Evans decided the smoke could wait. He triggered the ship's general quarters alarm personally. His executive officer would later recall, "The captain didn't ask permission. He didn't wait for the squadron commander's order. He just attacked." Johnston accelerated to 25 knots, black smoke pouring from her stacks. The range to the Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano was 18,000 yards, still too far. Evans kept closing. At 10,000 yards, Kumano's forward turrets flashed. The Japanese were using armor-piercing shells, meant for penetrating thick plate, not for unarmored destroyers. They punched clean through Johnston's thin hull and exploded beyond. Still, the concussions ruptured seams. Water began flooding the aft engine room. At 7,000 yards, Johnston's forward 5-inch guns opened fire. Shells arced across the narrowing gap at 3-second intervals. Spotters watched them fall short. Evans ordered the gunnery officer to add 500 yards, then another 500. At 6,500 yards, the rounds began hitting. Small explosions blossomed along Kumano's superstructure. The cruiser's secondary battery, 5.5-inch guns, returned fire. The volume of shells passing overhead created a sound like ripping canvas. At 5,000 yards, Johnston achieved torpedo range. Evans ordered a spread of 10 torpedoes. The fish left their tubes in sequence, splashing into the water, accelerating to 27 knots. Runtime, 4 minutes. The crew watched the white wakes arrow toward Kumano. 3 minutes in, Kumano turned hard to port. She was too late. A torpedo struck forward of the bridge. The bow disappeared in a geyser of white water. When it collapsed, Kumano's forward turrets were pointed at the sky, useless. She fell out of formation, flooding, reduced to 12 knots. Evans didn't wait to assess damage. He swung Johnston toward the next target, heavy cruiser tone. The range was 12,000 yards, too far for torpedoes. Johnston's guns kept firing. The aft mount had lost power. The crew was loading and firing manually. 10 rounds per minute instead of 18. The barrels glowed red. Then Johnston entered the rain squall. Visibility dropped to 200 yards. Evans used it, swinging south, reloading torpedo tubes by hand. It bought 3 minutes. When Johnston emerged, she was 4,000 yards from the battleship Congo. Congo's 14-inch guns fired. The muzzle blast was visible even at 4 miles. Orange-white spheres expanding, then dissipating. The shells arrived 8 seconds later. 3 hit. 1 penetrated the bridge, killing or wounding every officer present except Evans. It severed his shirt and 2 fingers off his left hand. He wrapped the hand in a rag and kept giving orders. The second shell destroyed the aft steering compartment. Johnston could only turn left now. The third hit killed the forward engine room crew. 11 men dead instantly from superheated steam. Johnston's speed dropped to 17 knots. 3 miles astern, USS Hoel charged into the gap Johnston had opened. Then USS Herman. The Japanese formation, which had been executing a disciplined closing maneuver, began to fragment. Cruisers turned to comb torpedo wakes. Battleships opened range. Kurita's staff begged him to press the attack, but the admiral was seeing destroyers everywhere, charging through shell splashes that should have obliterated them. At 0730, Samuel B. Roberts received the order from Taffy 3's commander. Small boys, attack. Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland didn't hesitate. Roberts was a destroyer escort. Smaller, slower, less armed than the destroyers. She had 2 5-inch guns to their 5, but Copeland had trained his crew relentlessly. His chief engineer had coaxed 28 knots from engines rated for 24. The crew called it riding the governor. Dangerous, potentially fatal to the machinery. Absolutely unauthorized. Copeland ordered 28 knots. Gunner's mate 3rd class Paul Henry Carr took station at gun 51, the aft 5-inch mount. Roberts charged toward the heavy cruiser Chikuma at a convergent speed of 45 knots. The range dropped from 15,000 yards to 10,000 in 8 minutes. Carr's gun fired every 6 seconds. Loading, ramming, firing. The mount was open-backed. Spent shell casings piled around the crew's feet. The temperature inside exceeded 120 degrees. At 10,000 yards, Chikuma's 8-inch guns found the range. A shell struck Roberts' port side amidships. The explosion opened the hull like a can. 3 men died instantly, but the bulkheads held. Roberts kept closing. At 5,300 yards, Roberts launched her torpedoes. All 3 fish ran true. Spotters watched them track toward Chikuma's waterline. 1 hit amidships. The explosion stopped the cruiser dead. Her starboard engine room flooded. Power lost to half her turrets. But Chikuma wasn't done. Her forward turrets kept firing. At Soit 5-1, a salvo struck Roberts's fantail. The shell penetrated the aft engine room and detonated against the keel. The blast severed structural supports. The entire stern section began sagging. In gun 51, Paul Carr loaded another round. The breech was damaged. It wouldn't close properly. Carr wrapped his arms around the 54-pound shell and held it in place manually while the gun captain fired. The breech exploded. Shrapnel tore through Carr's abdomen and chest. He collapsed on the shell, still trying to load it. When the damage control party reached him, Carr was barely conscious. He looked up at Lieutenant William S. Burton and whispered, "Fire one more, just one more." Burton looked at the gun. The breech was destroyed. The barrel was cracked. Firing would kill everyone in the mount. Carr died holding that last shell. By 0900, Roberts was dead in the water. Her forward gun still fired, manually loaded, manually aimed. 23 rounds remained. The crew kept fighting until the Japanese destroyers closed to 2,000 yards and the order came to abandon ship. Roberts rolled to port and sank at 0910. Of the 224-man crew, 89 were killed or died in the water, but Chikuma was out of the fight. Kumano was limping north, and behind the smokescreen, 4,000 Marines aboard the transports watched the escort carriers turn south, away from Japanese guns, and survive. What Admiral Kurita saw from Yamato's bridge that morning was chaos. His carefully coordinated attack had dissolved into individual ship actions. Destroyers that should have been obliterated were still firing. One, later identified as Johnston, had survived 3 separate engagements and was now harassing the cruiser column from 8,000 yards, despite being visibly crippled. The torpedo attacks had forced his battleships to maneuver independently. Yamato had reversed course twice to avoid torpedoes. In doing so, she had steamed away from the carriers, the primary target, for 15 minutes. When Kurita's flag secretary calculated their position at 0930, the center force had gained only 8 miles on the escort carriers in 2 hours of pursuit. The smokescreens compounded the confusion. American destroyers and destroyer escorts carried smoke generators. They had covered the ocean in chemical fog that radar couldn't penetrate effectively. Japanese optical rangefinders, superior to American models in clear conditions, were useless. Gunners were firing at muzzle flashes and radar contacts, scoring hits through volume rather than precision. Then came the aircraft. Taffy 3's escort carriers had launched every airplane they possessed. Wildcats strafed Japanese battleship bridges with 50 caliber machine guns, weapons incapable of penetrating armored conning towers, but psychologically devastating. Avengers dropped torpedoes set to run shallow, forcing battleships to turn away. Many of the torpedoes were training models, no warheads. It didn't matter. Kurita's captains couldn't know which were live and which were dummies. Commander William Dow Thomas, an aviation ordnance officer who survived the battle, later wrote, "Our pilots made dry runs after they expended ordnance. Anything to keep the Japanese turning, dodging, disrupting their formation. We had pilots flying over cruisers at 300 feet with empty machine guns, and the cruisers were maneuvering to avoid them." At SO 911, Kurita received a report that American fast carriers had been spotted to the northeast. They hadn't. It was another escort carrier group, Taffy 2, but Kurita's staff believed the report. If Halsey's fleet carriers were entering the battle, the center force faced annihilation. Japanese carriers had been sunk. There was no air cover. American dive bombers would massacre the battleships in open water. At 0925, Kurita ordered a general withdrawal. He would later write in his action report, "The enemy's disposition and tactics, and our observations of planes on the nearby shore bases, indicated this was not an isolated carrier group, but one with considerable strength." It was one of history's great misidentifications. The considerable strength was 6 escort carriers armed with 5-inch pop guns. The planes on nearby shore bases were the desperate dregs of Taffy 3's air groups, landing on Laty's dirt strips to rearm with whatever the ground crews could scrounge. The intelligence failure went both ways. American commanders believed they had faced the entire combined fleet, every capital ship Japan possessed. Post-battle analysis concluded that only coordinated sacrifice by the screening vessels had prevented catastrophe. Official Navy assessments stated that Taffy 3's survival was extraordinary, and that losses would have been total if not for the destroyer attacks. But the most significant revelation came from studying Japanese battle damage. Kumano took a single torpedo from Johnston. That hit removed her from the battle, and eventually led to her sinking by submarine 2 weeks later. Chikuma absorbed 1 torpedo from Samuel B. Roberts, lost propulsion, and was scuttled the next day. The heavy cruiser Chokai was crippled by an aircraft bomb and scuttled. 3 heavy cruisers, 30% of the center force's striking power, eliminated by vessels they outweighed 7-1. The mathematics that had seemed so impossible at 0645 had been rewritten by three factors: speed of attack, accuracy under fire, and enemy psychology. The destroyer escorts hadn't won through firepower. They had won through making the enemy believe they were facing something far more dangerous. Of the 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts that charged the center force, only 2 survived. USS Hoel sank at 0855 after absorbing more than 40 hits. USS Johnston, her engines destroyed and hull riddled, capsized at 0945. Commander Evans went down with her. Witnesses saw him standing on the fantail as she rolled. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. USS Samuel B. Roberts, the destroyer escort that had fired 608 rounds from her forward 5-inch gun, more than her entire wartime ammunition allocation, sank at 0910. The survivors spent anywhere from 20 hours to 4 days in the water before rescue. Sharks took an unknown number. The official casualty count for Taffy 3's screening vessels, 1,583 sailors. Of those, 130 died in the battle itself. The remainder perished in the water, waiting for rescue ships that were delayed by confusion over which American vessels had been sunk. Gunner's Mate 3rd Class, Paul Henry Carr, received the Silver Star posthumously. The citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action." Survivors testified that Carr had loaded and fired his gun manually for over 20 minutes after the mount's automatic systems failed, and that he had continued trying to load even after receiving wounds that proved fatal within minutes. The Navy named a destroyer escort after him in 1945, USS Paul Henry Carr, commissioned too late to see combat. Admiral Kurita reached Brunei Bay on October 28th with 13 of his original 23 warships. Japanese assessments concluded they had sunk 3 or 4 American fleet carriers and multiple cruisers. When captured documents revealed the truth that the carriers had been escort vessels and the cruisers had been destroyers, some Japanese staff officers refused to believe it. The battle off Samar forced a fundamental reassessment of destroyer tactics worldwide. British naval observers noted that American destroyers had adopted aggressive independent action to the point of recklessness, and that it had proven devastatingly effective against superior forces. Post-war Soviet naval doctrine incorporated Taffy 3's tactics explicitly. Coordinated torpedo attack by light forces can defeat heavy units if executed with sufficient aggression and acceptance of casualties. The Marines who landed on Leyte, the 1st Marine Division, 11th Airborne, and Army divisions staging through the beachhead, never faced Japanese naval bombardment. The invasion proceeded on schedule. MacArthur's return to the Philippines, the operation that would sever Japan's oil supply and doom the empire, succeeded because 3 destroyer escorts bought 2 hours with their hulls. Today, Samuel B. Roberts holds the distinction of being the smallest warship in U.S. Navy history to engage a battleship in surface combat. Her wreck was discovered in 2022 at a depth of 22,916 feet, the deepest shipwreck ever located. Explorers found Gun 51's breach still open, frozen in the position Paul Carr had held it when the mount exploded. The Navy remembers October 25, 1944, as the day the tin can sailors proved that tonnage and firepower matter less than initiative and courage. Every destroyer and destroyer escort commissioned since Samar has inherited that legacy. When the choice is between dying in formation and dying attacking, you attack. The 4,000 Marines aboard the transports never learned the names of the sailors who saved them, but they walked off those ships, fought through the Philippines, and came home because 3 destroyer escorts decided that a 1,350-ton warship could fight a 72,000-ton battleship and win. There's a doctrine in naval warfare that smaller vessels should avoid engagement with capital ships. It's written into every tactical manual. The mathematics support it. The history, before Samar, confirmed it. Destroyers that challenge battleships die. That's the lesson of Jutland, of the Java Sea, of every surface action where tonnage faced tonnage. What happened off Samar wasn't tactics. It was calculus of a different kind. 3 destroyer escorts looked at 4,000 Marines and decided that some mathematics matter more than others. The equation wasn't firepower versus armor. It was what happens if we don't versus what happens if we do. Paul Carr didn't calculate his odds when he wrapped his arms around a 54-pound shell and held a broken breech closed with his body. Commander Evans didn't run a probability analysis before turning Johnston toward Kumano. Lieutenant Commander Copeland didn't wait for instructions that would never come. They attacked because the alternative was watching men who couldn't fight back die behind them. October 25th, 1944. 7 escort vessels charged 23 Japanese warships and broke the back of an attack that should have succeeded. The pagoda superstructures that rose from the dawn haze that morning retreated into the dusk, chased by destroyers that shouldn't have survived the opening salvos. Sometimes superior numbers lose to superior courage. Sometimes the smallest warship in the battle decides the outcome. And sometimes 3 sailors with 1,350 tons of steel and nothing to lose save 4,000 Marines who never learned their names. If you found this story as fascinating as I did researching it, I'd appreciate if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are dozens more untold stories from World War II that deserve to be remembered, and I'll be bringing you a new one every week. What should I cover next? The Battle of the Philippine Sea, the submarine war in the Pacific, or the air campaign over Japan? Let me know in the comments below.